Hello and welcome to this video. And I've got two guests with me today, and I am not going to introduce them. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So, John, could you introduce yourself, please?
Okay, thank you, Andy. I'm John Phillips. I have taught for many years in Singapore, but I'm currently back in the UK now, living here, um, fashioning a different kind of career. I'm writing fiction at the moment rather than academic philosophy. Um, my academic background includes um, deep immersion in what Andy has referred to as postmodern philosophies. Um, I don't agree that these are postmodern philosophies. I agree only to the extent that these are philosophers of the postmodern for the most part. And for that reason, they remain very contemporary. And this is where I come from. That's my background.
Brilliant. So John is championing a certain viewpoint philosophically. And on this video, obviously, we're dealing with aesthetics, which I think is something that doesn't get dealt with correctly, I'll say. It does get dealt with, but not correctly. Now, Brendan, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, my name's Brendan Lavor and I work at the University of Hertfordshire. Uh, do not neglect the schools that you haven't heard of when you're thinking about your admission choices. Um, and so my background is in philosophy of mathematics and science, but it's a bit broader than that might first suggest because I wrote my doctoral stuff about Imre Lakatosh. And in order to understand Lakatosh, who was Hungarian, I had to understand stuff about mid-century Hungarian Marxism and his relationship with Lukács, and I had to learn all about Hegel and how that modified the Marxism that they were all into at the time, and so on. So, so I've got that in my bag as well. And I have a kind of long-standing interest in questions about ethics and religion and stuff like that.
So I've got two brain boxes with me, to put it simply. You know, those of you watching it, we got the two brain. But the thing is that the reason why they're here is because they watch the channel, they like the channel, and they've been brought here by something I'm talking about. And of course, I am just a mere rock and roll drummer. I've got a degree in fine art, but I'm not an academic. But a lifetime of making music and trying to make music that was successful. And there's the first problem. How do you make successful music? How do you have a career? And so I've thought quite deeply on what makes good music. And one of the conclusions I've come to is that aesthetics are sort of related to ethics or morality, what we think's right or wrong. And within there, for me, there's a problem because when you're making art, you will say, is it any good? And the word good has two meanings, and it can be good as in it's right, we've got it right, it's sounding great, or it can be good as you're a good boy and you've done the right thing. So for me, within there was always a question of how morality or ethics related to aesthetics. And one of my beliefs is that aesthetics, the only way I could describe it is that morality and ethics exists within aesthetics. That aesthetics come first. They start with our view of quality rather than quantity in the world. Now, Brendan, and it's not the first time he's done this, he has pushed back against what I've said, which I welcome very much. He's done a great video, and it references the good life, which I instantly made me like it, because anybody can explain philosophy with the use of any British sitcom is a good guy in my book. So, Brendan, do you want to just outline here? Now, the link to Brendan's video is below. If you want to stop and watch that and then come back, that might be useful. But Brendan will outline it a little bit here, what he disagrees with me about. Because he actually said I was wrong, and he did it in capital letters.
Well, this is the internet, right? And Andy explains in, I think, more or less every third video the necessity of doing some clickbait if you also want to do something serious. So I was trying to do a kind of Edwards Redux, the distilled
Admit it,
essence
you
of.
feel bad about it. There's on some level, you feel like it's unethical doing such a thing, but you've done it anyway.
Well, I mean, like you say, all of this starts from um, I mean, your musical experience is somewhat more extensive and um, professional than mine, but everybody has done something grubby, right? I mean, played something that you really don't respect because somebody was paying you, or because they'd throw you out of the band if you didn't agree to it. Um, uh, okay, yes, I could talk about that for quite a bit, but you quite often talk about art in quite general terms, and so, well, art does this, art is like that, and um, I've got quite a lot of Wittgenstein in my background, and if you've you know drunk even a little bit in the sort of later Wittgenstein wells, as soon as people start saying, well, this abstract term is just essentially like that, and I'm watching you thinking, God, Andy, I wish you'd say that some forms of art sometimes do some of this. And then we could talk about what kinds and on what occasions and
Mm.
get into the practice. Um, so, aesthetics and ethics. Sometimes you say that they're related, and more or less every sane person who writes about that thinks that in some version or other, right? There were people like, I mean, Oscar Wilde, for example, said that, there's no ethics in aesthetics, whether it's just whether a book is well written or badly written, but there's no ethical question, right? But most people who think about this stuff don't buy that, and struggle to believe that Oscar Wilde really believed it. But then you say something else sometimes. Sometimes you say that they are actually one and the same. And that's a much more difficult thesis to sustain, because they are conceptually different, right? People do different things with these words. As in preparation for this, I just threw those terms at Google Scholar to see what came back. And one thing that came back was a load of architecture articles where people use them as contrasts and say, look, there's a tension in architecture between ethics and aesthetics. Because, the ethical build isn't necessarily the aesthetically pleasing build, because the materials might be environmentally degrading or something, right? Now, how's that possible if they just collapse into each other?
Because the building of them has got nothing to do with the art. That's completely separate. It's like going, oh, this paint that you painted the painting with, it'll degrade in a couple of years' time, so it's not great paint. And it just hasn't got anything to do with it because you're in a completely different realm. But before I start
Right,
really
right. But
pushing,
the point is that those architecture essayists were using these two concepts, and they were using them in contrast. Now, all right, you might make a move where you escape the contrast by, carving off one bit of discourse from another. But the point I want to sort of stick on is that they are separate. Now, I think if you want to argue that they have something to do with each other, you need them to be separate, right? If you want to argue that ethics and aesthetics sometimes have a bearing on each other and sometimes help each other out, you need them to be conceptually distinct, right? You can't give yourself a hand. You can't lend yourself money. And ethics and aesthetics can't help each other out and inform each other if they turn out to be one and the same.
my point is that ethics is not the totality of aesthetics, but aesthetics is the totality of ethics. That all
Right.
all moral judgments have their root aesthetically. You see, so if somebody watches Schindler's List and then decides that the Nazis were really bad, for example, and that decision, that moral decision that they've made at the end is not the art, but it's contained within the art. It's it can't. It's not a matter of fact. It's not a matter of maths. It's not a matter of the grid. Nothing there will explain it. It could only be delineated through the start. I suppose is aesthetics. That is my point. That I can't see how it isn't. It's in any realm, because basically my view is that human beings, in terms of consciousness, are dealing with quantity and quality. Those are the two fundamental things we deal with, and they relate to a sort of evolved response to the world. That's my sort of basic view of the world. That's how I
Yeah,
see it, and that's how I
yeah.
approach art, is from that
I
point of view.
one of the things I notice is that you are quite fond of reductive dichotomies. Watching you doing philosophy on your videos, you quite often do something like that, where you say, well, there's quantity and quality, and those are just two separate things, and I find that quite hard to get on with, kind of
Could you name
philosophically.
something in terms of our consciousness or our perception of the world that isn't within those two realms?
Well, it's not. It's not that they're not exclusive. It's just that it's the next bit where you say, well, quantity is all is sort of that's science and material fact, and then quality, that's experience and the kind of the human element. And you think, well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't carve up that easily. I mean, you know, on the one hand, psychologists can do experiments where you can measure the intensity of people's experiences. On the other hand, a lot of the stuff that scientists talk about, you know, is qualitative. And the other thing that I noticed, so
Can you
is that,
explain? Give us an example of how a scientist would discover, describe something qualitatively. How science does that? Because I just cannot see how
well,
it does.
there are things like phase shifts, right? Something flips from being a liquid to a solid, and you know, there's stuff like that. Well, what I was going to say is
How
that
does how does how does science know it's flipped from a liquid to a solid? I'm
because
sure
it's
it's I'm sure
because it's
it's quantified and not quality. The scientist's
yeah,
not saying, "Oh, it just feels like it," or "I think
no,
it."
right.
That's
So
my
now, but
point. So
now
they have to go out and explore, and although some of these
right,
things
but
don't
measurement, but
yeah.
measurement isn't the only kind of exploration, right? That I mean, yes, we live in a world of like science is kind of Galilean, and
Mm.
you mathematize the world, but there is such a thing as discrete mathematics, right? That's and discrete mathematics has scientific applications. It turns up in science. So yeah, I mean, we've run off into some technical territory, but
Well, look, when I thought about having the discussion with you, because we had another discussion just you and me before, but I thought it would be interesting to have someone who's neutral in all this. So, we've
well, we
asked
don't
Dr.
know that he is,
Well, we
right? He
don't
might
know.
be.
I've got an inkling he might be on my side.
Okay.
But the thing is that what's interesting is if Dr. John is on my side, then and he has a background in what we call postmodernism. I'm going to have to swallow that down, which is where I have to admit another kind of defeat in what I've been talking about on my channel, and that's what I'm here is that. Do I have to argue against you by actually going towards certain philosophical arguments that are rooted in later 20th century philosophical thought that I've been sort of criticizing, or do I have to go, yes, I think you're right, Dr.
No,
Brent?
no, you
So,
don't have to do either of those things, right? But we'll get John in a minute. What you have to do is decide what it is you really care about, right? And that to me seems to be what you really seem to care about, is that art should have a function in the collective negotiation of ethics, right? That's what you really want, isn't it? And I don't think that's a mad thing to want,
Mm.
right? If you were, if I had you as a dissertation student, we were doing this over a sort of extended period. What I would be trying to guide you towards would be articulating the thing you really want and making an argument for it without making commitments about consciousness and the nature of science and uh, fundamental dichotomies which may or may not be true.
Yeah.
There's a thing.
Well, you didn't like this about me before. It's my grand narrative thing, isn't it? It's these sort
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
zeitgeists and these huge, big, overarching sort of ideas that
That's right. That's
when
right.
I'm
That's
so
right.
anti-ideological, then I have these. I understand that, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like it. And see, the thing is, I don't because I'm an artist. I don't actually mind this. I actually think the truth's in here somewhere. Is in my uncomfortable feeling of going. I don't know. I actually don't know what the
Right,
answer is.
right, right. But if you want to turn that uncomfortable feeling into some understanding, you
I
need to
don't know
turn
whether
it.
I do.
Oh, but all right. But we're here to do philosophy, so that's kind of
Well, you're a Wittgenstein fan. What was the last thing he says is in the tractates? I'm sure you'll be able to do it word for word. Is that there's a certain point where we is the philosophy our ability to go. This is we're now at the limit here. We have to move over to the artist to
Thereof
check.
one cannot speak, one must remain silent.
That's
There.
what he
yeah.
said.
Well, he said it in German, and I
He
now
did
learned
say it in German.
there are now 6 translations of the Tractatus available because
And
it's out of print and they're
Oh,
all at it.
we would
see,
rather
he's
abandon the
getting like the
variant.
Bible now. We can all argue over.
Anyway,
But
look. I've got a lot more I could
well, I think
hector
John's been sat
Andy
there so
about, but
patiently.
John's rocking
John,
backwards and forwards. So
let,
come
let's
on.
let's clear the way for John and let him have
Yeah.
a give you a long. We'll give you a long time to really explain your position because yours is the mysterious position at the moment. So
Okay, well, definitely don't want to dominate this discussion, which I think is fascinating, and I'm very much enjoying it. However, I will say one or two things about where I believe that Andy is coming from to start with, just as a way of sort of building a frame around what I have to say. I mean, the reason that I'm a subscriber and I follow Andy's channel is because of what he says about music that I love and that have loved from a very early age, around about 14, um, where this music was so influential on me that it caused me to abandon my studies and become a musician myself, probably to my detriment in my longer term career. However, um, at the time, and we're talking about the 70s, we're talking about 1975, the music that I loved included the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Genesis, Van de Graaff Generator, uh, music which ever since I've regarded as probably the pinnacle of all music in the 20th century and hasn't been superseded in the 21st. So, so there's something in the way that Andy speaks about this music that really grabs me. And this has to do with the way in which popular music is regarded, certainly at that time. And I noticed that the BBC has a 50 years ago thing going on like everybody else at the moment. So they're showing Michael Aspel interviews from 1975. One of them is with the great conductor Andre Previn, who had a little bit of kind of messing around with jazz in his earlier career, which he then gave up to become a composer of film music, I think, and television, and then become a great director of orchestral music by Mahler and Beethoven and the greats. So, in this interview, I only saw it a couple of days ago, so it's on my mind. Um, Michael Aspel asks him about rock music, and he explodes. And he says, "This is just rubbish. This is pretentious nonsense." And he cites an album cover where the person who he doesn't name is regarded as having been influenced by Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Now, I've got that album cover. It's Frank Zappa he's talking about, although he doesn't mention it. And he regards this as just nonsense. He was lured in by the idea that this is a composer who's been influenced by the greats, but he listens to it and it's just nonsense to him, just unlistenable guff. So in that context, I actually think there's a movement currently, and I've been asked to write books on this as well, which is a form of returning to an earlier form of art appreciation. So since about the end of the war, art appreciation kind of died out. And there were a number of other things going on, like cultural studies is the way of putting it. Instead of thinking about how we appreciate it, how we evaluate as art the music or the painting or the writing or whatever it is we're interested in, television, sitcoms, how about that? Instead of thinking about that as art, it becomes part of popular culture. And popular culture is, by definition, popular and significant in an ideological or in a cultural way, but maybe not art. And I think that position is changing. And I think we're beginning to understand that there's a way of appreciating art forms that were not really regarded as art forms. And this isn't a postmodern position of the kind that Andy has described recently, suggesting that everything is art. Not at all. It's very rare to find a sitcom that you might regard as art. I believe The Good Life is one of them, and everyone involved in it excels in one way or another. Although I must admit, I find it a bit odd that you found a kind of a moral lesson in it, but nonetheless, it's great art in a certain way. Not as good maybe as Steptoe and Son, which was greater, and the characters more complicated and more difficult to like. But you couldn't help liking them. And there's something very strange and truthful about sitcoms that can do that. So I think returning to a form of evaluation that belongs to a much older era, like the early part of the 20th century. In my field, literature, for instance, we'd think of critics like F.R. Leavis, who would read a George Eliot book. And I noticed that you quoted George Eliot, and I think that's a fantastic quotation and a great find. But F.R. Leavis would say of George Eliot, this is a great book. And he wouldn't explain why necessarily. It's not because of, technical reasons or anything like that, but having read it, its balance, the range of characters, the tensions between the characters, the way the narrative flows, the various sort of messages that come through. It's just a great book. Whereas something like Daniel Deronda, her final book, which is much longer and sort of in two parts, not such a great book. He would say that, and this is true. And so returning to this way of thinking about art, but now the pinnacle of 20th century music would be, well, after Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Why not? Absolutely, Frank Zappa. And so in a way, this forms the ground and the framework for my understanding of Andy's statements, the good and the aesthetic, right? The ethical and the aesthetic merge here. Not only merge, but rather the ethical is subsumed in the aesthetic. That, I think, is a controversial statement, but maybe not that controversial. And I just wanted to say one reason about that I think that is that many of the philosophers that I have studied over the years, 20th century philosophy is my thing in general, not particularly continental or Anglo or mathematical or aesthetic or any of these things, but just in general. My friends call me a philosophical slut because I don't come down on one or the other. I'm fascinated by philosophy in the way I'm fascinated by prog rock, right? I even like Van de Graaff Generator. So all of the philosophers.
That's the postmodern coming out in you.
That's the postmodern coming out in me. Because I can do something with any philosophical argument, which a postmodern philosopher is capable of doing. They can identify the undecidable and put that to work. Because philosophy is, in general, as Andy suggests, has truth in it. There's truth somewhere in every philosophy, but it takes a while to tease it out. And so, aesthetics, which aesthetics are we talking about? There's an aesthetics of life. Dilthey, Michel Foucault, aesthetics of life. There's an aesthetics of form, going back to the sort of Kantian framework. Kant's a good case in point because he identified two quite separate areas of philosophy in knowledge on the one hand and ethics on the other in his practical philosophy. But he couldn't sort of bring them together until he created his aesthetics in the critique of judgment. And the critique of the power of judgment was a way of somehow framing and bringing together these two other separate forms of philosophy. And we don't have to believe Kant, but I think the aesthetics of form goes back to that and goes back to that idea. And then there's the aesthetics of knowledge. And the aesthetics of knowledge doesn't even necessarily require thinking about art, but thinking about the documents within which knowledge is produced and formed. And there's aesthetics of action. Now, people that Andy doesn't like are involved in this aesthetics of action, like Adorno, Benjamin, all the 20th century Marxist aesthetics philosophers. Now, the good in this respect is to be located politically, so that a great poem by Heinrich Heine, The Silesian Weavers, somehow evokes the tragedy of the Silesian weavers and their uprising against the bourgeois mechanism that rendered them poorer than they've ever been before. So there's this whole sort of realism in a Marxist sense coming out of this poem. And Engels' favorite painting by Karl Hubner of that very same scene, the Silesian weavers. There's truth there because it demonstrates a political situation, a ground, and various things like that. So aesthetic, whether you agree or not, these different brands of aesthetics manage to capture almost anything that one might want to think about. And the final aspect is mainly people who wouldn't consider what they are doing as aesthetics, and in some ways absolutely deny that what they're doing is aesthetics. However, what they're interested in tends to be what aesthetics is also most interested in, which is emotion, feeling, the whole sort of network of qualitative marks that make up one's consciousness. And then, who am I talking about? I'm talking about the people that I have expertise in and have written about: Freud, Heidegger, Derrida, these people. And that's my postmodernism. People who deny that they're aesthetics, but actually treat what we most understand as aesthetics. Derrida, in particular, seems more concerned with ethical categories like friendship, philia, eros, agathon, these Greek terms. Friendship, The Politics of Friendship is a book by Derrida. But fundamentally, it's an aesthetic reading of the entire history of attempts to deal with friendship and enmity and ethical issues, perhaps best cast in an aesthetic light. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, we'll pass it over to you, Dr. Brendan. I just want to say that this is brilliant, and I'm having ideas from what you've both said and seeing where my position is, where I'm going to Dr. John saying stuff and he's going on and I'm going yes, 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 and then at a certain point I go, oh, hang on, and I can feel myself retreating over to maybe Dr. Brendan's corner as well, where I get to the point and go, hang on, it's all well and good, but we've got to remember it is aesthetic. And then it doesn't go, and that's the thing. I think that might be what my point is and where I can give a little ground to Dr. Brendan on this. Maybe what I really should be saying is not there's a totality of this. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to carve it out so we don't make the mistake of going beyond it and thinking that science and truth can sort of talk about aesthetics in any way that isn't just about the truth aspects of aesthetics. Of course, it can talk about it, but it can't ever do what art does, and art can never do what science does. And so for example, Freud may not be an accurate description of the cognitive science aspects of our brain, and maybe the scientists will find things that counteract Freud. But if you want to understand an Alfred Hitchcock film, Freud's a brilliant way because Freud is an aesthetic view of psychology rather than a a, a, a truth view. I mean, I know cognitive scientists who've said to me, psychology will be completely replaced by um, uh, cognitive science. And
Well, Andy, I mean, there's just something I need to say in response to that. I mean,
yes, yes,
I
of
don't
course.
know where we stand in relation to psychoanalysis. In the end, I don't believe we're going to locate the truth in psychoanalytic theory necessarily. I mean, we locate a lot of things, a lot of very interesting things. We learn an awful lot. But I just wanted to say one thing about the psychoanalytic process, because psychoanalysis is nothing without the psychoanalytic process, where you have an analysand and an analyst. The analyst and the analysand in communication with each other. There's no psychoanalysis without that relationship. That relationship involves the analysand speaking, coming up with things. And one of the dimensions in which the psychoanalyst considers illness to be present is the dimension where the analysand can't admit to something, is not able to accept into their purview certain positions, certain emotions, certain desires, certain things that they would rather not believe about themselves. So, in a way, the analyst is attempting to turn the analysand into a scientist, into someone who is capable of taking everything into account in order to come to a conclusion that would therefore be true. And the psychoanalyst is attempting to tease out the truth of the analysand's position. So I think, in that respect, that's science.
Ah, I have to I'll say it here because I don't mind admitting it. I had 4 years of working with a counsellor. It was like it was a transactional analysis based psychologist. 4 years, and this has influenced my in such a great thing. It's influencing what I'm doing here, and the psychologist that I work with, he actually when I got set up, I did a video called it was something like it was for about anxiety in musicians. It was one of my first
Mm.
successful videos that wasn't about just music, and I had loads of people all over the world contact me about it. And my psychoanalysis will not speak to me, so I'm not friends with him because that was part of the deal. But I did message him, and he did watch it, and he went. I'm really pleased that you've got to this view, as though it was my view. He wasn't saying it was the view, but he said he really appreciated that I'd arrived at my view and that it was helping other people. And so yeah, that is I'm stumped by that one, to be honest, because I understand what you're saying in terms of how our internal search, which art is so related to in terms of who we are and how to, I suppose, better ourselves, which is a moral judgment, is scientific in nature. So I understand that bit. Oh, I'm going to be confused at the end of this. This will all be food for thought, but I'm not in your business. I don't have to know anything. I can just go away and go, let's see where we're at. So, Dr. Britt, I'm sure you want to come back in now. What do you think?
Yes. I mean, I'm just to begin with. I don't think that John and I are occupying opposite corners
No, I
of
don't
some
either.
intellectual
No,
boxing ring. So the way you've
no.
been kind of scoring this and saying, "Oh, now I'm moving towards one or towards the other," You
Well,
know,
hopefully people are viewing this because that's exciting for YouTube. You see, that they'll go, "Oh, there's a bit of a thing going on here," and Andy set it up like these. He's got these two guys to come in, and then, but where are we going with this? Because I feel my position slightly melting. That's the feeling I get is of my going right, Andy, because a philosopher I worked with many years ago. He always used to say to me, he used to say, Andy, your problem is that you think you know. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, you always say, I know this or I know about this. So I've developed, I think there's a journey towards something which is very interesting. And I don't think we can arrive there, but we can always arrive close to it. So I'm hoping that the sort of consonance that arrives at the end of this interview will be something that people will take away more than what we've actually said, if that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, it takes more than one discussion for us all to learn what each other's words mean
Yeah,
precisely. This
yeah.
is why effective philosophy seminars go over a period, and people return to conversations and finally
Well,
figure
to
out what it.
just jump in, I like to call you Dr. Brendan. I'm only doing that to be a bit facetious, but because I know you both don't like it, and I'm going to keep doing it. But the thing is I think that this discussion is going to arrive at a point, I hope, where we actually start to talk about individual pieces of art. And I
Mm.
think what John said about looking at this is the great gift, postmodern gift of 20th century rock and roll. It's that Bob Dylan thing of believing that there's worthwhile art in something that those you know um, post-Victorian critics would have dismissed. I think that's John's really profound point today, is that we are moving to a point where we need to return to that sort of qualitative analysis of art. So we've got to go back to saying that's not art, right? That I think that's what we've got to. That is art, and that's not art. And there's a quest towards art rather than everything is art. But we inherit from the latter part of the 20th century the idea that could exist anywhere. Because going forward into the TikTok, Instagram world and the AI world, we're going to have a really good ability to put things through a qualitative process, which I think is what I'm trying to get across on mine. So that was really well put, and I'm sure, Brendan, you're going to come in with something to back that up now, I hope.
Well, yes, absolutely. One thing to be aware of, like, a ricochet is not a creative, thoughtful act, right? So just going, well, the Pomos thought that everything was art, so now I'm going to go, hardly anything is art. It was like,
Yeah.
well, okay, let's try and be a bit more thoughtful. But yes, I would like to see departments of literature having grad students writing theses about rhetoric on social media, right? Maybe they are. Maybe
They are.
somebody is. Sure,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
they are.
somebody must be doing this, right? And making judgments of value about better and worse meme craft. Because as you say, we can't go back to the we don't want to be in relativism soup, where we just people are so suspicious of any judgment of value that people just, we don't want that. But we also don't want to go back to the kind of eminent Victorians where I'll tell you a little story actually, because like most people with relatively humble origins, I have a complicated relationship with classical music because it's posh, and however good it is, and however much you come to you play Bach and you think everything else is crap. Actually, there's a
I
moment
don't.
when you go, no, you don't. Well, no, but you don't stay in that judgment, right? Of course you don't. You
No,
don't stay
I
in
only
that.
have that with Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Right, exactly. But but the thing is, that there's this improving Like you're supposed to like classical music because it's improving, makes you a better person, and so on. At some point, I want us to talk about musicking. You know, the Christopher Small book. There's the stuff about in that I want us to get into. But I remember seeing, Vanessa May, the violinist. I remember seeing an album cover where she was relatively young and she was wearing a t-shirt and it wasn't wet, but she was standing sort of thigh deep in the ocean. So there was a definite kind of narrative steer that this t-shirt was going to be wet fairly soon. And all of my kind of the power of classical music to intimidate me kind of fell away. And I thought, that's smell the glove, isn't it? That's So there's all that. I want to get back though to a sort of ethics and aesthetics and so on, because there are things I was thinking of as you were both talking. I mean, there are, lots of philosophers think that ethics and aesthetics are in some way related. So somebody like Iris Murdoch, for example, who talks about, that the things people find funny, the way people decorate their rooms, the way, their choice of footwear and all that, whether they care about how they do up their neckties or whatever. That's all. That aesthetic aspect is sort of, but of course that isn't art. So one of the things we've got to remember is that aesthetics is much bigger than art, right? Especially if you're going to develop the concept of art the way Andy does and say, well, actually works of art are very rare. And I think if I understood your argument from your Void video, actually very little of what hangs in art galleries is going to qualify as art, because most of it is just reproduction of established stuff, all the portraits of Spanish kings and fishing boats at anchor and all that stuff. We've talked a bit about Wittgenstein. Like I say, there are very few philosophers who think that aesthetics and ethics are just one and the same, right? Most people who get into this think that they relate in some way. Now, Tractatus. The thing you must always remember about the Tractatus, the one thing we know for sure about the Tractatus is that it doesn't work, and that the man himself explained why it doesn't work. So before we get too excited at having found a bit of something that echoes Andy Edwards in the Tractatus, let's remember that. But here he is, Tractatus 6.421. It's clear that ethics cannot be stated, ethics is transcendental, and then in brackets, ethics and aesthetics are one. Now, the reason I've come to this is not just to blind you with technicality, because I know the Tractatus more thoroughly than you do. Although, of course, that is, part of what.
Oh, you do?
Absolutely, no.
I don't know if you know more than John, but you definitely know.
I doubt I do, actually. I mean, you're the way he picked up and dealt with your question about about analytic philosophy was a tour de force. So I'm certainly not going to fence with John about the contents of the Tractatus. But the thing is, there are lots of different kinds of normativity, right? There are lots of different kinds of judgments of value. Like you say, there can be a good bit of gameplay. There can be a well-made shirt. There can be a virtuous action, all right. So and there can be successful art. There's lots of different kinds of normativity, and one of the reasons that I get twitchy about this, ethics and aesthetics are one, is that I don't really want to see all those different kinds of normativity boiled down into soup. I think it's all more interesting if we distinguish them between them, because they don't always go together, right? Somebody, an assassin can do a bad thing with a good shot, right? Or if you're playing chess with a small child, you don't want to thrash them too severely. So you do a good thing by making a bad move, right? That normativities come apart. That's important.
Well, the thing is, I was watching a film last night called Bone Tomahawk, and it was a western, so it was in the
Yeah.
genre of westerns, but it was about a sort of there was a cave full of these flesh-eating troglodytes that kidnapped this girl, and these guys had to go and save them from the troglodytes, and I found it quite interesting. It was a bit slow, but one of the things I was thinking about is this idea of when you go to the sort of into the Western genre, they have this idea of good and bad, and it's really delineated, but they're having to negotiate their ethics on the spot. So you have the sheriff, and the sheriff is trying to uphold some idea of European Western law, but actually that he's as lawless as the people he's fighting. And we come down to this sort of negotiation of morals. Now, it would be very easy to say killing people is bad, but killing people isn't always bad from a moral point of view because it's negotiated in that our government gives permission for people to kill, because we have an army and they are trained, and when they go out and they kill, they're not going to go to prison for it. Although they, in certain situations, they could kill in a way where they could go to prison. And so the negotiation of a very basic ethical and moral thing that it's wrong to kill people is not straightforward. And we can go through all sorts of examples where it's okay to kill people. And we've got this going on at the moment about euthanasia and people, deciding to kill themselves, and all this. So that what my point was is that, and I agree with you, Brendan, on this, is that is so complex and multi-level that to have some overarching things saying it's wrong to kill in a Kantian sense is doesn't seem to work because it never does. But the moral thing of saying it's wrong to kill is also really useful. And so we do have this big dichotomy there going on, that I want the world to have this big moral virtue of thou shalt not kill. It says in the Bible that we won't kill. I think that's really good, and it's fenced off in a way where we think it's a really bad thing, and yet at the same time know that it has to be negotiated. Now, if we're negotiating whether people should, if they're really ill, be allowed to go to Switzerland and have themselves done in, and whether we should have that in the UK, and then you could buy a kit from Boots, the do your own death kit, and see that what I've done there is cracked a joke, a bad taste joke, because the only way we could really deal with this is through art, and everyone could talk about it, but you have to feel it. And so I would like to see the film that says why it's good, and then the film that says why it's bad. And then I'm going to judge it, I'm afraid, on my feelings and my emotions that have been manipulated by clever artists who have done good art. And so that every moral judgment will come to that. And no scientist can say, oh, well, it'd probably be best for the society if we did. But there's just no place for that. It can only ever have its root in what the artist has to say, not even the philosopher. The philosopher can talk about it and delineate it, but it's always the artist. And so what I'm trying to do is elevate the role of the artist. So in our Western culture, which is sort of post-literate, post-industrial culture, rather than having this domain where the scientists we know what a scientist is and what they're doing, and we've got to respect that. But I don't feel like the role of the artists. That's the overarching thing is us valuing what artists do and go,
Yeah, I mean,
we can't exist without them.
That gets into a lot of it. And so one of the reasons I mean, first of all, one of the things I think you can learn from the shipwreck of the Tractatus is that the harder you go with your scientism, the stronger your ricochet into woo-woo mysticism. Now, Wittgenstein's scientism was diamond hard, right, in the Tractatus, which was why his ricochet into woo-woo mysticism is as violent as it is. with you, I don't think it's quite as strong, but I do feel that there's quite a strong dose of scientism. Your picture of what science is and how it works, I think is quite Dawkinsy. But we don't have to agree with Richard Dawkins about what science is and how it works. And John gave a few hints about how else we might think about science in his remarks earlier. So there's that going on. I think that ethical failures are very often failures of the imagination. And so I'm all in favour of exploring ethical dilemmas and ethical questions imaginatively, right? And I don't think propaganda is always out of the question either. So the example I use with my students is, the public information campaign to persuade people to stop drink driving. That didn't just have a list of alcohol-related road accidents. It had, big, gnarled-looking firefighters crying when they tell you about what they found in the wreckage.
But I believe all art is doing that. Every single piece of art is doing that in some respect.
Well, okay,
What
yeah,
you're describing there, the Mona Lisa does, and I think the Bible does. And I
right,
think that,
right.
de Kooning and Stravinsky,
Yeah.
they all do this.
Well,
That's what
okay,
they do. They don't. That's what they do. Is that thing that when you went, oh, these gnarly firemen crying, that
yeah,
juxtaposition and the balance of those two things, that dichotomy that you just described, is profound and points at the sublime. I think, and I believe there's a thing called the sublime, which is what you are trying to aim at. And my scientism comes in that if you tell an artist that what you're always trying to do is you're trying to balance these two things, that because human beings can't. And so the artist is trying to balance these two things always, which I have come up with this idea of it's hedonism and perfectionism. That's it doesn't describe it, but that's the closest one. I could say heaven and earth. I could say Apollo and Dionysus, and I've said all this over and on my channel. But it's the balance of those two things, and that comes from my awareness of what when you're doing good music, you are aware that you are on a tightrope between those two things. That is my contribution to this. I'm not a philosopher, but I've played a lot of music, and I've done like drum clinics. I've had to go out and show off, and I've been involved in very technical stuff. And what I find is that when you are doing it right, you are balancing those two things. And I think every musician will. That's one thing that's solid. When most musicians goes, yeah, that is right. If you imagine the recording studio, you're putting a part down. It's a tightrope between trying to get it perfect, but also have the feeling in there, and you're trying to come up with the magical mixture. And I think that is very important in terms of how we determine our ethics. I think that's made my point, and I've said it in one sentence. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying about the ethics of killing people is quite interesting because I think this is part of the tension in art from time immemorial. And I would point to, say, the surviving plays of Sophocles, and particularly the Antigone, where the sister.
I don't know what you're talking about there. Brenda's nodded. This is why I got you in.
Well, I'll put the drama into
Yeah.
place. It's about a death penalty, basically, and the myth has allowed the two brothers, the sons of Oedipus, to kill each other on the battlefield in the attempt to invade Thebes. Now, the two sisters, Ismene and Antigone, have to decide: are we going to go out and give the funeral rites to our brothers, particularly the brother who was attacking rather than the brother that was defending? And the king who has taken over, Creon, has made a decree. He's made the decree because it's important to do such things when you're ruling a city, that it is the attackers are not to be buried and not to be given their funeral rites. So here's Antigone, knowing that it's wrong, but going out anyway and giving funeral rites at dawn to her dead brother. So she then meets the death penalty and is walled up in a special little bedroom type, cave type, what she calls it, a bridal suite and a funeral pyre at the same time. So, so this has been the artwork that has dominated not just the West, but the entire world for 25 centuries or more. The tension there is so great that it is never laid to rest. And
Well, she's sort of laid to rest in a sort
yeah,
of a bubble of not being laid to rest, isn't she?
it's a
It's
bubble of
even
not
that,
being laid to
yeah,
rest.
even you know, and I think at this point, I think we already met at this. I think what we're doing is that it has to be discussed. I think that's the answer. It has to be discussed because it's an ongoing negotiation. Would you all agree with that? That there's that an artist doesn't. I think an artist's responsibility is different to a philosopher or a scientist. So I would say when I make these grand statements, they're aesthetic, and that's how because I became very aware that my YouTube, having a fine art background and actually been trained in sort of postmodernism at college, Roland Barthes being the big guy that we got taught about. When I started to do this channel, I became very aware of the mechanism, the aesthetic mechanism of a YouTube video, which I don't think anyone else has thought. They just thought you're just talking on camera. But I was like, yeah, we're not talking on camera because what's in the background counts, and what, and it's like this right now. There's a part of me that wants to upset the apple cart here because everyone knows what we've got. We've got two philosophers. We're talking about them. We're talking about this. But how could I make the point we're trying to making? I could actually undo this, by maybe you're actors and you're not philosophers. And I reveal that at the end, and you go, "Oh, these are just two." My mates, and they're just one plays guitar and the other plays bass, and we just thought we'd invent this. So I've got people go, "Wow, what's that? What the hell's that mean?" And it would question the idea of knowing stuff. Now, one of the things I want to put to you, based upon what John said, and based upon what I just came, I'm discussing there. If you take the YouTube from my point of view and what I've learned about it, what I became aware of is that in all art, we got taught at college that you have form and content. And for me, form and content is that dichotomy that's always there. When you look at that sort of Greek tragedy that you've just described, there's the story and then there's the execution of that story. So you tell the story, but the story sort of works, but it would be much better to see the play because the play would have a form. How do you think those two things relate in terms of what we're talking about? Is that do you think that dichotomy that always exists in art, which I've tried to, is this a thing, or is this just a small aspect of art, or is it because I think, Brendan, what I'm saying is that's the totality of it. It's that continual negotiation. And when art seems to be not dealing with morals, it is still doing that negotiation. It's just not applied to morals, if you see what I mean. If someone's just trying to show how awe-inspiring it is to stand on the top of a mountain in a storm, the classical romantic thing, that doesn't seem to have a moral component to me. But I believe that's the beginning of morals because you're having to try with the art to, in the same way as that play, negotiate form and content, negotiate the visceral and the grid, get all your colors right, make sure the perspective's right, but also have all the swirl and it all feels like this. And that culturally there's sometimes it's best just to go over to the swirl and you don't care about and then there's other times it's best to go over and really nail it and go what is actually, and that I think is that's the overarching part of art that I think deals with morals. It's that negotiation. And what do you think about that? I mean, I would have loved to just had a discussion on that, on the good life, and to explore with you guys who both seem to see a profound meaning in it, where that comes from. Does that help? I'm now in the realm of I'm having to close my eyes when I talk to concentrate, so I know I'm right at the end. I'm right at the limit of my brain power now. I'll shut up.
Well, I think profundity might be the wrong word. I'm not sure that The Good Life is profound. I think if it attempted to be profound, it probably wouldn't work in the way that it does. I think The Good Life works because it is a sitcom, right? And a sitcom is a specific kind of um, genre, if you like.
Hmm.
And it's a British sitcom, even better. And in a British sitcom, everyone is mildly ridiculed or quite severely ridiculed. But whatever, they've got to be ridiculed. And they've got to be ridiculed in a way that maintains your sympathy. So you're sympathetic to ridiculous people. This is how the sitcom works. All British sitcoms work
All,
in this way.
all,
American
all, all
sitcoms,
British art does
yeah,
absolutely a great
it's
aesthetic.
your English aesthetic,
Yeah,
basically.
and
Goes
the
back to Alexander Pope.
and
Yeah.
I call this the English settlement after the
Mhm.
XTC album, and
For
you've just
sure.
described it applied to the good life, which I just wanted to throw in. But carry on.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And so the tensions between the characters. Now, those of us who watched it in 1975, when it first came out, recognized the people in it because these were the middle classes doing what middle classes do. And each character, except maybe the one played by Felicity Kendall, um,
Barbara.
yes, Barbara, is is a type deserving of ridicule from the point of view of the viewers, right? Either the professional, and this is why I'm not quite sure I see the moral lesson that you see, Brendan,
Yeah,
but
I don't,
nonetheless,
Brendan. I've got to be
I
honest.
get what you're saying. I don't think anyone gets away with being, occupying the moral high ground in that sitcom, and I think that is its strength. That everyone, in one way or another, is failing in one way or another, and this is where the ethical resides, isn't it? In aspects of where one fails, where one doesn't quite succeed in being right or good. The other thing I like about The Good Life is its title. I mean, this is basically a translation from Aristotle, eudaimonia, and this has dominated political philosophy from Aristotle onwards,
Yeah.
basically.
It's like the
Aristotle
it's
more
like
or
the
less
Dolce
defines
Vita,
it.
isn't it? It's
Yeah,
the Italians do it with they got an eat bird in the wet.
and
The
post
British do it with
post
Felicity Kendall. You see.
post Roman philosophy, we don't say eudaimonia, we say felicity. So it's very nice that Felicity Kendall plays the role of the partner of Tom. So
But that's profound. You see, you've
it's
just said
profound,
it's
isn't
not
it?
profound, and
That's
now
postmodern.
I've had that little pinch of profundity when you said that, and then
Yeah.
you start to go, oh, maybe that I
That's just postmodern. That there's
I
nothing
know
about that that
I
has
know
any
I do fall
profundity
into
at
it.
all. However, the good life that with all of this in its background and all of this profound political import attached to that notion, um, that is mocked and satirized throughout the entire. Or how many seasons were there of The Good Life? I can't even
I think it was
remember.
about five. I've got the box set.
Yeah, yeah.
But isn't it celebrated at the same? Isn't this the English settlement that is celebrated at the same time
Yeah,
as being ridiculed? That's a something that British art does in a very specific way.
yeah.
And on top of this, I come from the generation where we love the young ones, and I tell you, this episode of the young ones subfuses my channel. People don't realize it's an episode of the young ones which where they refer to the good life, and it actually the good life starts up and the title starts up, and then Vivian actually physically rips it down, and he goes, I'm bloody fucking sick of this, and there's a whole thing that goes on. Recently when I was doing my assessment of Mary Spender, I got in trouble where I said I don't fancy Mary Spender, I just want to protect her. And everyone, then a couple of feminists had a go at me because they didn't realize I was quoting from that episode of The Young Ones. where they it's like the sort of postmodern English, but it's then ripped apart and put back together. It's there's a I think my point is here is that I believe that there is profound things going on in the good life and the young one's reaction to the good life, and I think you could sit down and discuss that and get to a sort of aesthetic truth which is profound or sublime. I think, and that's why they're great art. That's how, and I think it's that discussion we need to have more. I think that's what we need going forward is that discussion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a thing I think I've learned from years which is that anything that advertises itself as deep is unlikely to be more than moderately profound, right? So, Tolkien, oh please, right? Whereas, the kind of discussion you were just having about the good life actually takes you somewhere. I'm teaching Nietzsche at the moment. The thing about Nietzsche is he gives up on Wagner and transfers his allegiance to Bizet. So he goes away from these sort of bombastic stuff where you're trying to deal with the big themes by talking about gods and dwarves and stuff. And you go towards a story about very ordinary people committing, making very ordinary mistakes and committing a very ordinary crime, performed with tunes that you can whistle, right? And Nietzsche is somebody that nobody should have an easy relationship with Nietzsche. Nobody should just agree with Nietzsche. Even Nietzsche didn't just agree with Nietzsche. But there, I think he was kind of onto something.
But
If anyone's knocking Tolkien, I'm not down with it. I'm afraid.
Oh, he's rubbish. He's rubbish, and The Hobbit bothering gets in the way of my enjoyment of Led Zeppelin. Really. Anyway,
The hobbits have the good life. They represent the good life. When you go,
they do.
I want to go to Hobbiton. I
oh
want to live
God,
in a
no,
hobbit
no,
hole
no,
because
no,
they
no,
have the
no.
good life and it's threatened. It's threatened by all sorts of forces and they don't want to fight it, but they have to.
There's no jazz in Hobbiton. There are no jazz clubs in Hobbiton. You'd hate it.
But
The
there's a lot of
good
jazz in
life happens
Wagner.
in cities.
Well, they
But
do go
anyway,
to the city, they do experience it, but that's better exemplified in Star Wars, which is basically the same thing as is Harry Potter. They're all the same thing, but in Star Wars, they actually do go to that jazz club. That is, and that, but you cross the tracks. You see, when you go there, you don't want to live there. You want to have the good life, but you can't. You have to go and face it. But the good life is
okay.
so. I mean, I could sit down and talk about the Lord of the Rings and I mean, I often did with my students. There's certain complex, things I would deal with using either Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. The films, not the books, the
Yeah, yeah.
films, because you could deal with it. That people could understand certain
Right, right,
ideas.
and you can have that if you've all read something or you've all seen the same film and it's got you know and it's got plenty of cultural inheritance flowing through it, even if the author wasn't entirely aware of where all that stuff was coming from. If you've all seen the same film, then you can discuss these issues with a level of sensitivity and precision that you can't get if you just deal with the abstractions. I mean, that's certainly true.
I
But going back,
disagree. I disagree with that because I think that the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter have got they've got something in that I'm afraid has been sort of identified by Jordan Peterson. It's that Jungian view of these archetypes, and in Star Wars' case and Harry Potter's case, both of those, George Lucas and J.K. Rowling, had really studied those archetypes so they could deal with them. And I think Tolkien, obviously, his academic background, and I think that his turn away from that academic world that he was in at that point, the sort of same era as Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell and all that English philosophy thing, towards dwarves and dragons was actually is closer to being like Bizet than it is being like Wagner. And so I think that though that this sort of return to Jung and looking at these bigger, um, powerful, sort of ever-present things, which we've also just discussed in the sort of Greek these ideas that these storylines and aesthetic effects that have always been there. See, modernism tried to rip that up. The postmodernists tried to nail it as well. I probably shouldn't do this because John will say they all said different things, but this idea that it was just. I think the idea of AI hangs over all of this. Is that we have to move away. I would say to be keep John happy, the cliche of postmodernism, which everything is just is constructed out of other things. That idea there's no real art, and so AI, if it, because that's what is the problem with AI. You can go to. Have you been to Udio? And it's just amazing. And you go Mavish Orchestra mixed with Dolly Parton and write a
Yeah.
song about flowers, and then a minute later it appears, and you go, oh my God, because it's just reconstituted everything. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's art, and I think that's the big stance we have to have aesthetically going forward now. Is go art doesn't do this, just doesn't do this, and it does do what Star Wars does, and it does do what Dylan does, and it does do what the Sex Pistols. It also does what Bach does, and to be able to argue that these things do contain a, a, a certain amount of profundity or sublimity. Does that make sense? I don't know if
Yeah,
the
and
words.
Andy, I have a question though about AI. I mean, we've been living with these models for a while now, and they can do all of the things that you say. And we've got
Mm,
images of the Beatles dressed as the Beach Boys and the Beatles as if they were prog and various things like that. I mean, there's just
mm,
tons of it,
yeah,
and it all is immediately recognizable as AI. Is all entirely algorithmically driven and recognizably so. Do you think of this as in some way a threat to the ability of musicians to create in maybe more
I
traditional,
what I
more
think is I think this is what's motivating my position at the moment is I think that discussion, it was on Radio 4 this morning when I was driving to my studio. That discussion is not wide enough, it's too limited.
Mhm.
Because and one of the things that's informing me is I've really been on YouTube because I'm not a great reader anymore because my eyesight's not good. So I find that I was a real big reader when I was younger, but I'm watching a lot of interviews with quantum physicists and the discussion of the way quantum physics relates to consciousness. And there is an argument going on, with is it Penrose, that guy has got a certain position, and then there's this other guy Fagia, I can't remember. Uh, do you know?
version.
That's him, yeah. And
Mm.
so I'm watching these with great interest because the discussion seems to be what human beings are. Are we just material mathematic zeros or ones, or are we not? And if we're not, then AI cannot do what human beings can do.
Yeah.
But the danger is, and this is the is it Ian McGilchrist? That guy, is that
Mm.
culturally in the 20th century have moved to an aesthetic which acts as though we are machines, and I think and I think we have to move away from that because that's at once limiting, but also it makes us believe that we are beyond the realms of nature. And so, if we want to solve things like the climate crisis as well, we have to be able to see our position in the world more accurately. And this is something that only the artists can do. The artists have to step forward and come up with this. We can discuss it all, but as we said, it's easier to discuss these things when everyone's watched Star Wars. We need that art which actually places us in a, and it's something to do with consciousness. It's something to do with the material of consciousness. I think is aesthetic. I think all the mathematicals and numbers and all that sort of stuff is something that human beings have had to develop. But I think if you go back to the human beings stepping out of their cave, 200,000 years ago, their experience was entirely aesthetic, and art deals with that. That is
The
so. My answer is you culturally we have to stop thinking we're machines. That's an aesthetic idea in itself that we're machines.
Yeah, Andy, the um, the caves. Now that's a good case in point. All of those strange animals drawn on caves in the ochre, sort of glowing ochre colors. Um, we've discovered recently, because I mean, people have been trying to interpret these ever since that dog found the ones in France in
Yeah.
the 40s. But we've been trying to work out what's going on here. And I think we've discovered, at the very least, that these animals represent constellations. So what's printed on the cave walls is is something like a calendar, and these predict the equinoxes and the solstices for something like 5,000 years. Um, so these cave drawings are highly sophisticated calendrical and therefore scientific diagrams of the night sky, indicating what's likely to happen over years. So and that can mean a lot of different things. But one of the things it means is that consciousness, as we know it today, has not evolved much from 17,000 years, something like that.
I don't. I mean, this idea that the material universe is bound up within our consciousness rather than the other way around,
Yeah,
and
this
that
is the Fagian
numbers
idea,
are a
isn't
part of
it?
that.
Yeah. Mm.
And so, is it Fadji, the guy that you mentioned?
Yes, it is. Yeah, yeah.
He said something that really struck me, and I'm an arty farty type, so
He
I
wrote his
respond to
book
things.
last year. Yeah,
Yeah,
and he's been touring
I
around.
respond to things aesthetically, but he said if you take a computer and you go down into that AI, you will end up with zeros and ones. But if you take a human being and goes down to the that cell that we're made out of, you won't find zeros and ones. They're not
Well,
there.
all I would say about that,
Brendan, as a philosopher of mathematics, he's having to
there's
rub his to tell
all
me.
I would say about that, Andy, is that, I mean, Husserl made this case, exactly this case, in 1897, reading the logic of someone called Schroeder, who was summarizing the entirety of 19th century logic. And Edmund Husserl's, before he'd become a phenomenologist,
Phenomenology,
and
yeah.
invented phenomenology, he wrote a kind of fairly humble review of this, saying that this logic is not deduction in the classical sense. This logic is algorithms. That's all it is. And he made a fundamental distinction between thought on the one side, which is something that you have with consciousness, and algorithms, which is all about calculation and manipulating symbols. And so that distinction, I think, stands today, and it's something that we need to understand better. But it's an old distinction. And
Yeah.
I think in philosophy, we've known what Fagin is looking for from the point of view of a quantum scientist. We've known about it for a long time. Wittgenstein, I think, in the Tractatus is provides a way of sort of attempting to document the what we might call the constellations of thought, similarly to the way the stars operate in the night sky. In fact, he makes that analogy somewhere. So I think we've known about it for a long time.
Brendan, come on! I know you. I mean,
Well,
this is
yes. I
your
mean,
thing.
there's a lot to say. I mean, Penrose part of Penrose's argument is to do. He relies on Gödel, and the kind of too long didn't read version is to say there's more to mathematics than ones and zeros. There's more to mathematics itself than algorithms. So one of the things that I go kind of head clutching, tooth grindy, is occasionally, Andy, you'll say, well, mathematics, that all reduces to ones. No, it doesn't. That's part of what one way of reading what the results of Gödel's results, and that's what Penrose is relying on. And that's the kind of reason why I'm not wild about these reductive dichotomies where we go, well, there's maths and science over there, and there's art over here.
Brendan, can you tell us where numbers come from?
No,
You can't.
not quickly, because I've got a few other things I want to get to.
That's a quotation from Fagin, though, himself, isn't it? It reduces to noughts and ones. He says, I've seen him say that on
and Andy said that talking to me.
Right.
It's
no, I think what you're saying is really great. I mean, because my gut feeling is that as you go back to those people in the cave, and you go back through Western art, and you look, actually, if you look, say, you take music, and you take this idea of the music of the spheres, and you go back to Mozart and the magic flute and how they're dealing with the music of the spheres, and then you keep going back and back through down to Pythagoras, you actually see these things coming together. And I have a sneaking suspicion that zeros and ones aren't they aren't watching, like, well, I can't even put it into words 'cause it's hard to put it into words, but they're not, that's not the end. But it's whether it's how it's contained within our, how does it contained within our aesthetic view of the world, because Pythagoras obviously was a mystic, wasn't he? And that's, as though, although all the bits we've taken from him, it's like taking one aspect of him, and then we have separated. Oh, I know I have to. It's my job. I'm here. I'm doing.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah, you jump in. I'm right
yeah,
at the limits
do you mind if I take us back to something you were saying, because you talked about euthanasia and exploring this through, and I mean, you did say you would want the film for and the film against. I don't want that. I want the film that is like Antigone, that presents you with all the ambiguity in one place, in one scene.
But those two films would be the attempt to do that. You would hope that what would be great art would be the one that does both. Yes, I totally take that.
But right. I mean, Sophocles doesn't say, well, there isn't a version where Sophocles where Creon is just right and Antigone should just do as she's told, and in another version of the play where family piety triumphs, like that. That's the value of the thing, is that it's all unresolved in the one artwork. I think there are some consequences for the kind of line you're taking, Andy, which I'm not unsympathetic to, but I think it has some consequences. So one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that, on the one hand, I do think that ethical failures are very often failures of imagination, and the way we've been talking about artworks and dramas and so on are part of our efforts to think through all this stuff. I mean, philosophers talk about Antigone all the time, but at the same time, I'm a bit nervous about aesthetics as a guide to ethics, precisely because you use the word manipulation when you were setting that up. So look, clever artists that are going to manipulate my view on this. Well, yes,
that's what they do. Yes, they do that.
Exactly. And the more you push this line, the more you put responsibilities on artists, which I'm not sure artists may want and they may not be ready for. So if you're going to do an art project about climate change, you're going to have to be up on the science. You can't just do it on vibes.
No, you would. Yeah, but what you would create from the science would not be science. It would be art.
Right, it would, but it's going to be responsible to the science.
Yeah, but you might not want to go to the scientist who's got the results in his hand. He might not be the best person to present the moral conclusion that comes from those. His job should just be go, these are the numbers. This is the
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, you tell me.
A scientist could do that if they were an artist at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. But where I'm going is, I mean, you've had to do. I've never set foot inside an art school except to go and see the degree exhibition of Friends. I don't really know how artists are trained, but when artists are being trained, is it explained to them that no, you've got to get the science right? You can't just react to the vibes. You can't just react to the surfaces and
But they can. They can do whatever they want. That's the whole point. They can do whatever they want.
right. But but you've no. But if you say no, art has this very important role to help us negotiate our ethics and decide what to do about climate change or euthanasia or whatever it is, then they can't do whatever they want because they've got a responsibility.
But the only reason they can't is because it's not about responsibility, because the morals do not overarch the art. They do what they do, and the whole thing about art, it's not aesthetics. Art is you create something, you stick it out into the world, and then people see it, and the life of it is in those hands of those people. And the postmodernists were certain, right? We were right in a limited way when they said that the art is it the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not.
Mhm.
It's both of these things, because when you look at an artist, when you look at Michelangelo, part of it, well, all of it really, is you're going into the mind of Michelangelo, and there is a conversation going on, and that's and art. What happens is that when art goes out into the world, it has uh, it, it, it has a utility which is based upon how much it reaches people. And the reason why I came to this is that if you take like pop songs, for example, you can actually analyze pop songs and go, this is why this was a massive hit record, because of this, this, and this. And what it is, it's like a magical thing where it works with people, because we're at once individuals and we're also humanity, and art seems to pull those two things together. So yeah, you could go make your rubbish film about climate change with no scientific, you can do that, and it might be that there's something profound in that. Imagine a child doing it, and they got all the science wrong, but they've done a picture, and you go, "Oh my God, yeah, that's the idea of a child. The science doesn't matter, does it? What matter?" So I don't want to ever limit it. I always want to let the scientists. I just don't think the scientists have got the respect that they should have in our culture to let them get on with what they do. I don't think our education trains kids how to actually do that at all. And so we don't have that in our society at the moment. Our society, I think, Western sort of liberal democracy, if we value it, was as much a product of art as it was of science. And there's a certain glory period that you could think back where we imagine that our English cities are very palatial and beautiful because the two things are at one. And then the modernism, the buildings they're tearing down from the 1960s is a sort of failure of this, because we have lost our value of again, it comes back to this same problem with AI. We have lost the value of us as human beings and who we are, and that we're not a machine, and that buildings have to be beautiful as well as functional.
Yeah, I mean,
Does that make sense to
yeah,
answer it in
absolutely.
any way?
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. I mean, I'm a sad old humanist, right? I've been, any number of postmodernists and posthumanists and so on explain to me that my faith in individual subjectivity is terribly misplaced and all that. So again, I'm not. We're not. I was at a memorial concert for a musician friend on the weekend, and that was a series of live performances. And some of the material that was performed was standard stuff. So it was repetition of old material that everybody recognised, but it had a particular significance because these are the standards from that particular musical community, and playing it on that occasion, made a difference. Some of these were also songs people made up on the fly about the lad who died, and the fact that it was all live, was really important. So I think I don't really care whether we can tell in the end. I mean, John's right that at the moment, the stuff that AI is giving us just reeks of AI, and you can see that it can't do fingers, you
But it
know.
will do. It
It
will be
can
able
But
now.
it,
to. Yeah.
it can
Well,
now.
Oh,
Have they,
fingers are okay now. That's
have
yeah.
they
been
solved the fingers?
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
It will be indistinguishable from art that has existed before.
Yeah.
I got art when I was watching somebody demonstrating it online, and they went, right, let's put in a Latin jazz fusion track with lots of percussion. And when it came out, the bass sound was the same as Jaco Pastorius. The saxophone sound was the same as Wayne Shorter, and the keyboard. And no one had said that. And I thought, oh, this isn't going and going over the whole history of humanity and pulling out the sort of platonic. It's just copying Weather Report because it went, oh, Weather Report, oh, we'll copy that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that will always be the case. And so where that was valued in the 20th century, because we were in this modernist and postmodernist, post-industrial world, we got Henry Ford, and we tried to make our music act like that, and then we tried to rebel against that at Woodstock and all. That's what's been the big theme. We now have to just throw that all away, and our art just needs to go, look, we're human beings, and this means keeping the mistakes in, having no music industry, music being more communal, music being about much closer to the creator and the participant and the listener. That needs to all go exactly what actually is happening. You don't have to make this happen. You have to accept it's happening, and you have to roll with those punches, which for some bizarre reason, and I think it's because of a horrendous this sort of psychological thing I went through over the last few years, which is the underlying esoteric part of my YouTube channel, is I've sort of stumbled into this, which is why I'm talking to two very esteemed philosophers here, because I know I've stumbled into something and I don't really know what it is, and I'm trying to get my heads around it. And I think talking to you guys today, I think it is just actually happening. We just have to watch it. It's like it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's
I mean,
it's going, and we've got to just notice it. We've got to see what's
yeah. I
actually
mean,
going
I
on.
find that I'm only really interested in live performances now. Um, I mean, records are kind of. I mean, I kind of use them as documents, but I'm not looking for a great record. I want to be present at a great moment.
Well, I tell you something. That interview I did with Stanley Jordan. Stanley Jordan is like the Bach of our era. The guy is just incredible. And me and Roy Marchbank's a pretty hand guitarist, like one of the greatest in the world. We're sat there in the Zoom meeting with the headphones on. You'll never get it because it's a recording, but we were live. So we're chatting to Stanley Jordan, and he's got the guitar in his hand, and he's saying, "Is this sound all right?" And then he starts up. It's all in there. When that to be in that experience with him live was just so profound, and I was like going, "Oh my God, I'm experiencing being in the presence of like Bach or Mozart because this guy is on that level." I really felt that, and so did Roy. So I had Roy there to back it up, and we were going, "My God, that was a bit something else." And you get a whiff of that when you watch the video. This technology here enables us to do that. We've just got to be aware of it. This technology allows us to have this conversation, which should never have a conclusion, because actually that I see this as art. It's got science and it's got philosophy, but this is art. It's like, we've got I'm seeing the sort of there's a trinity there of images in front, and there's there was supposedly one person, and then there's another person, and then there's, so there is the dialectic embodied aesthetically in this video. I can see that from my art training. You could say that's not really there, Andy, but I just said it was,
We
and
we,
that's
we, we cut we cut across John. He was about to say something, and we.
yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, something that I've been saying quite a lot. And a few months ago, when we first had a conversation, Andy, I think I said this too. I mean, I see philosophy as an art. It's not the same art as, say, music or fiction or poetry, but it is an art nonetheless. In the same way that one considers rhetoric, and you were talking earlier about films that might persuade, that would be a rhetorical component to a film, and it's down to Sophocles that he's able to create a dramatic work that doesn't persuade you in one way or another, but gives you something that requires decision on the part of those who are watching, or say the chorus.
And that
No,
decision's a moral decision, isn't it?
yeah,
And is that the difference between art and science, what you just said there? Is science is trying to come out with something that can be verified.
I don't think so.
You don't think science is trying to
No,
do
I
that?
don't think that. I mean, science isn't that mysterious to me, quite honestly. It's something that through experimentation you can arrive at an objective understanding of something, and you can call it a fact, right? And a fact needs to be disproved, or it needs to be something that you can attempt to
But isn't
disprove.
that the opposite of what the artist is trying to do? True great art never has that resolution because it's dealing with something else.
It,
We've all come. This is the big conclusion we've all come to, is that great art. There's the profundity in great art when you feel it is the fact that it's not resolved. That lady is boxed up in a room, which is both, a wedding chamber and a funeral.
that's quite right. But think of all the examples of artworks that we can go to find portrayed in a dramatic form of one kind or another, some kind of presenting of evidence and making decisions in that way. So the artwork is capable of presenting this in a fictional or dramatic form, performing it. And so we're in the presence of something theatrical, and we compare the theatrical to something that we might say is not theatrical. So, for instance, in America, in South Carolina, they're putting someone to death somewhere. That's not theatrical. They're actually putting them to death in a
Mm.
theatre, but it's not a theatre in the sense that you're sitting in the theatre watching a performance of someone being put to death. You know, so there's a relationship between art and what art is representing, and art is capable of presenting, um, I don't know, examples of objective truth without it
There was an
feeling.
artist in South America a few years ago, and he rented an exhibition space. He found a dog that was basically starving to death on the streets of wherever it was, and he chained it to a post in that art gallery, and then let the dog starve to death. And there was a big uproar about it. And he was saying, "Look, you're quite happy. You're not upset about all the dogs that are starving to death out in the street, but you're bothered about this one." And they're going to say, "But you should have saved it." And he says, "Well, why? You're not saved." And that when I read about it, and there was a big criticism about it, but my art training was like going, but it is a really powerful piece of art because it's straight away. And this is what conceptual art does. Is about this. Is really to try and go to the heart of this. It just points to a certain thing and just makes it obvious that there's this thing going on that can't be resolved in there. And this is why I've always been a champion. I was fine art trained, so I like all that really avant-garde art. Now, the thing that troubles me the most is that there's certain types of artists that will go into nature and they'll just walk around. And Richard Long was one of these artists that would go into a field and then just walk up and down until he'd walked a stripe into the grass, and then they'd photograph it. And you could say, well, the photograph's the art, but I'm not too sure it is. I think the stripe is, but it's not there anymore. And one of these artists actually came to my studio a few weeks back, and he basically goes on walks. That's his art. And I was right at the limit of what I thought was art in discussing with him. But it is sort of art in a way. And so this idea of what you're saying is that you could have a situation where the guy really being put to death is actual theatre, or that the scientists doing science could do science in an artistic way. It could be an artistic statement. So because there is a place in the middle where they cross, there is a certain point where they are doing exactly the same thing. I think this is to do with our consciousness. I think it's the way we have to understand things and pull them apart to understand them. It's not that they actually exist out in the real world. Does that
But
make
this
it?
is, yeah, I mean, Andy, this is exactly what many of my students over the years would have called very postmodern. This idea that a theatre, we use the word theatre for courts of law. We use the word theatre for
Operating.
surgeries in hospitals, operating theatres.
Yeah.
But theatre, the
And
Greek
military
word,
theatre of operations.
Yes, yes.
yeah, theatre of operations, theatre of war. And that Vietnam was a theatre in a sense. And people have argued, postmodern philosophers have argued that Vietnam was literally a theatre in the theatrical sense, that the war fought there was theatrical in the artistic sense, which is a controversial way of arguing and something that would need to be questioned and discussed elsewhere. But this whole idea of theatre, I think, is the ground of the way you're talking about art.
I think because theatre embodies form and content, and it embodies in the now, and actually the direct relation. When I was teaching, the drama teacher said to me, he goes, "You know what theatre is?" He says it's just two people and two chairs. He said you go in the room and you put two chairs down, and one person sits on the one chair, and then someone sits on the other chair. They goes, that is theatre, and that was a profound feeling because is it as simple as that? Yes, you can sit on that chair and talk to that person. They watch you and listen, and then you realise it's a conversation. It's so close to just what we're doing now. I'd like to wrap things up now, and I want to wrap it up by the conclusion I've come to doing this is that people like you with your background should be talking about art more. We need philosophy types talking about art. You both have a great, love of art and a lot to say about it. And going forward, would you two enjoy coming back in the future at some point and actually talking about specific works of art or music and actually getting into the weeds in that? Because I think you two have got a lot to offer. And in terms of, I've got a platform, we got these videos here, and this would be an interesting piece of art in itself to have this discussion going on about art. I think that's what I want to get from you two.
But I've been dying to talk about Van de Graaff generator with you, Andy, over these months. So
Well, I think what we'll
that
do
would be
is
good.
if you can go if you want to talk about Van de Graaff generator, Brendan, you come up with something you want to talk about, maybe The Good Life or some other sitcom, and let's pull it apart with these ideas in mind because I think the thing I've got from Brendan, which I do agree, this would be a lot more useful being specific rather than general. That's my fault. Is trying, and why am I like that? I think it's a personality thing, and I'm going to go away and think. I think Brendan's right. And I think it's a personality thing with me. It's probably some sort of messianic Christ-like thing that I want to go down in history as of doing something like that. But I
You
did
see,
want
I
to
see.
say, look,
I was much easier on I'm much easier on you in my diagnosis. I think you were just ruined by your art school education to think in
I
these
think that's true.
broad brush, wafty terms when there's hard-headed, detailed philosophical analysis you could have been doing.
Yeah, when instead of looking at Roland Barthes and looking at pictures of Nazis and
Oh,
seeing which ones had the funny-looking faces in the background.
Andy, Roland Barthes, if he's anything, surely is a modernist, not a
Yeah,
postmodernist.
yeah. Well, you guys. This is why you got to set me straight. This is why you got to set me straight. But the thing that I just want to add at the end of this, which I've been wanting to say all the way through, I think the role of the jester or the trickster, as the young would have put it, the idea of the comedian. These are the two things that have emerged on my channel. Is that I'm talking about music, but I'm going deep into the aesthetic parts of it, and that seems to be of interest to some people.
Yeah.
But I'm also bringing in the comedy, and that's because I believe that the joke is the fundamental totality of art. When you tell a joke, that actually contains everything in it that art does in a way, and the the giver and the taker. You've got the audience. It's live. When it works or it doesn't work, and a joke always contains within it this sort of contradictory dichotomy that we can't quite deal with them at the end, and that's what makes us laugh is that. And I think I think that is the thing that needs to also be in this discussion is a sense of humor. I think that's why your good life analogy was so good. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Well,
of course.
you're trying to wrap it up, so we better just leave it alone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you just you want to get
So
out of here now, don't you?
you want to wrap it up by introducing the trickster, and there's probably just under a million things I want to say about this right
So
now. I'm
yeah,
not
well,
going to
the
say
whole
any.
point is what I'm
Yeah.
trying to do in my YouTube awareness, which you guys have with all your academic knowledge. You know how YouTube works. At the end of this, they've got to feel like there's going to be some more of this. I want there to be more of this, and I want them in the comment going, "I want to hear what you're going to say about the trickster. I want to hear what you're going to say about good life. I want to hear what you're going to say about Steptoe or Van der Graaf generator." And those of you who are watching now, what do you want these two big brains to talk about? Put it in the comments down below. Let's get a conversation going, and you can get involved. And I might even bring some people, the great unwashed in. How about that? We could bring in a normal person into this conversation that just wants to come in. Come on, this is what it's all about. Let's have a conversation and let's enjoy having the conversation because yeah, that's all it's really about, isn't it? Enjoying yourself and then dropping down dead. That's what we're filling it with some enjoyable bits in between. I've gone from one extreme to the other now, Brendan. Look what you've turned me into. Right, so shall we say goodbye to them all? And thank you, John Phillips. Thank you very much for
Thank
coming,
you,
and
Andy.
Brendan Lavor. Thank you very much for coming. I will. Is there any? Do you want them to come and see what you do? I'll definitely put a link to your YouTube, Brendan. But John, you exist in a much more ethereal world, don't you? Away from.
I'm going to start a YouTube. Um, I'm writing fiction now, and I want a wider audience. So,
I'd love to talk to you about the fiction.
mhm.
Because I'm going to say another. There is so much to talk about. Let's just get out of here. We've been here for nearly 2 hours now. So thank you all. Shall we say goodbye? And I get my finger on the stop because it must always stop in the sort of play away type. Bye bye everybody. Bye bye everybody. Bye bye. Oh, I can't ever do it.